The war in Europe was ending, but the alliance was not at peace. In the spring of 1945, American troops stood deep inside Germany, the enemy collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Victory should have simplified everything. Instead, it exposed fractures that had been carefully hidden for years. George S. Patton was no longer fighting the Germans, he was watching allies. Maps still covered the tables, but Patton's attention had shifted. Soviet formations were moving with purpose, not coordination. Boundaries agreed on paper were ignored on the ground. Supplies vanished. Civil administrations were replaced overnight. What Patton saw was not cooperation, it was positioning. He spoke about it openly. Too openly, Patton warned that the war's end would not bring stability. He believed it would reveal a new conflict, one already forming beneath the surface. He believed the Soviet Union was not a partner preparing for peace, but a power preparing for leverage. And he believed the Allies were walking into it willingly. Those warnings landed badly. The alliance had survived because discipline had been enforced from the top. Unity was not optional. Doubt was dangerous. Any suggestion that the coalition itself was a threat was treated as destabilizing, even reckless. Patton's concerns did not fit the moment the leadership needed to project. He was told, quietly at first, to stop. The pressure around him intensified. Political leaders were negotiating borders, reparations, and post-war order. Military commanders were instructed to maintain calm, avoid provocation, and treat Soviet forces as trusted partners. The war effort now depended on restraint, not confrontation. Patton did not adjust. Every observation he made sharpened his conviction. Soviet behavior in occupied territories alarmed him. The removal of resources, the consolidation of control, the disregard for Allied agreements all reinforced his belief that the next war was being shaped in real time. He did not frame it as ideology, he framed it as strategy. And strategy was his language. The crisis was not a single statement or incident. It was a collision between timing and reputation. Patton was a general whose value had always been momentum, speed, aggression, clarity. Now the war demanded patience, diplomacy, and silence. Those were not his strengths. The tension reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. His comments circulated. His assessments reached desks they were never meant to reach. Some were reported, others were summarized, softened, or stripped of context. But the core message remained unmistakable. Patton did not trust the Soviets. That distrust threatened something larger than personal relationships. It threatened the post-war settlement before it had even been finalized. Leaders in Washington and London understood that public unity was essential. Any visible fracture could unravel negotiations, embolden hardliners, and destabilize Europe before peace had taken hold. Someone would have to be contained. What was at stake was not Patton's career alone. It was the narrative of victory itself. The war had been won through alliance. To suggest that the alliance was already failing undermined everything leaders were trying to preserve. This was not a small disagreement. It was a challenge to the foundation of post-war order. If Patton was right, then restraint was dangerous. If he was wrong, then his words risked provoking a conflict no one was prepared to fight. Either possibility was unacceptable. The leadership could not afford to validate him, and they could not allow him to continue unchecked. Normal solutions would not work. Patton was not an obscure officer, he was a symbol. His reputation carried weight with troops and the public alike. Removing him outright risked backlash. Ignoring him risked escalation. Silencing him required precision. This was about more than pride, it was about control. To understand how it reached this point, it was necessary to step backward. Patton had never been subtle. His career was defined by confidence bordering on defiance. He believed decisiveness won wars, and that hesitation invited disaster. Those beliefs had delivered results, but they had also created enemies. He had clashed with superiors before. he had been sidelined, reprimanded, and restored. Each episode reinforced his self-image as a commander ahead of his time, constrained by cautious men who mistook restraint for wisdom. Success had validated him often enough that he trusted his instincts more than consensus. The alliance had tolerated this because Patton delivered outcomes. Speed mattered when momentum was fragile, aggression mattered when initiative was scarce. His flaws were accepted because his effectiveness was undeniable. But post-war Europe was not a battlefield demanding speed. It was a political landscape demanding stability. Patton did not adapt easily to that shift. Old resentments resurfaced. British commanders viewed him as reckless. Political leaders viewed him as unpredictable. His previous controversies were remembered, not forgotten. The same bluntness that made him effective in combat now made him a liability. The warning signs had been there. His public comments, his private remarks, his refusal to moderate language, each incident chipped away at trust. Yet as long as the war continued, those issues could be managed. Victory changed the calculus. The trigger was not dramatic, it was cumulative. Patton continued to speak, as if the war's next phase was inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. He questioned policies of cooperation. He criticized occupation arrangements. He implied that strategic advantage was being surrendered out of political convenience. These views crossed a line. They were no longer operational critiques. They were political judgments, and political judgments, especially from a general of his stature, could not be allowed to circulate freely. The reaction was swift but controlled. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic removals. Instead, conversations turned cold, instructions became explicit. His authority narrowed, his access diminished. Behind closed doors, the calculus was brutal. Allowing Patton to continue meant risking alliance cohesion. Removing him meant acknowledging that his warnings carried weight. Neither option was clean. Pressure came from all sides. Political leaders demanded reassurance. Allied partners demanded discipline. The media watched closely for signs of division. Every word Patton spoke now carried disproportionate impact. The walls closed in quietly. Patton was not unaware. He sensed the shift. He knew he was being watched, yet he believed the risk of silence was greater than the risk of consequence. To him, history was moving too fast for comfort, and leaders were choosing convenience over clarity. That conviction isolated him. The impossible choice was forming, not just for Patton, but for the command structure around him. Protect a general whose instincts might prove prophetic, or protect an alliance whose unity depended on suppressing those instincts. They could not do both. And as the war formally ended, the question lingered unresolved. Was Patton a dangerous liability, or an inconvenient voice speaking too early? The answer would shape not only his fate, but the strategic posture of the West in the years that followed. The decision was coming. No one would leave unscarred. The tension hardened as victory settled in. With Germany defeated, the rules that had governed behavior during wartime no longer applied cleanly. Military necessity had given way to political calculation, and the shift exposed fault lines that had always existed but were now impossible to ignore. Patton's warnings gained urgency precisely because they were now inconvenient. The trigger was not a single speech or memo. It was a pattern becoming impossible to contain. Reports filtered upward that Patton was questioning occupation directives, challenging policies of accommodation, and describing Soviet actions as deliberate expansion rather than temporary disorder. His assessments were blunt, framed in military logic rather than diplomatic language. That distinction mattered. Diplomacy relied on ambiguity. Patton rejected it. He described behavior as he would an enemy's maneuver, not an ally's misstep. To political leaders attempting to stabilize Europe, this framing was destabilizing in itself. It threatened to redefine the post-war environment as adversarial before agreements had even solidified. The reaction was immediate, though outwardly restrained. Senior commanders began distancing themselves. Conversations that once invited Patton's opinion now ended quickly. Guidance arrived phrased as reminders rather than orders, but the meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. His role had changed. His voice needed to soften. It did not. Instead, Patton doubled down. He interpreted the silence as confirmation. To him, the lack of pushback validated his concern that leaders were choosing short-term harmony over long-term security. He believed the Soviet Union was consolidating control while the West hesitated, bound by political commitments that ignored historical patterns of power. He did not believe this was ideological. He believed it was inevitable. That belief alarmed those above him. Pressure escalated rapidly. Political leaders worried that Patton's statements, even when confined to private settings, would leak. The press was alert to any sign of allied discord. Public opinion was fragile. The idea that victory had been followed immediately by suspicion and hostility was not a narrative anyone wanted to introduce. Allied unity had become an asset that needed protection. Behind closed doors, conversations sharpened. Patton's previous controversies resurfaced. His record of defiance, his public missteps, his unwillingness to moderate tone were reevaluated through a new lens. What had once been tolerated as eccentricity now appeared as risk. The question was no longer whether Patton was right. It was whether he could be allowed to continue speaking. That distinction defined the crisis. American leadership faced mounting pressure to act. British officials were uneasy. Soviet representatives noticed the tension and monitored it closely. Every side understood that unresolved dissent at the top could undermine negotiations already underway. This was no longer about a general's opinion. It was about control of narrative. The escalation became claustrophobic. There were no good options left. Silencing Patton risked validating his warnings in the eyes of those who trusted him. Allowing him to continue risked provoking diplomatic fallout at a moment when cooperation was essential to manage occupation, reconstruction, and demobilization. Normal disciplinary measures would not work. Patton was too prominent, too visible, too symbolically tied to American success in Europe. Any move against him would be scrutinized, interpreted, and politicized. The impossible choice crystallized. One path meant restraining Patton, reassigning him, limiting his authority, or removing him from the European theater entirely. This would preserve alliance cohesion and reassure partners, but it would also signal that dissenting strategic assessments were unwelcome, even when grounded in observation. The other path meant tolerating his warnings, accepting the risk of diplomatic friction in exchange for intellectual honesty. That choice risked destabilizing negotiations and accelerating tensions. Before the West was politically or militarily prepared, he couldn't do both. One choice would protect the alliance's image. The other would preserve a commander's voice. Both carried long-term consequences that no one could fully measure in the moment. The compromise that emerged was deliberate and unsatisfying. Patton would not be publicly rebuked. His service record would remain intact. But his operational influence would be reduced. His proximity to sensitive political matters would end. The solution avoided confrontation while achieving containment. It solved the crisis, not the problem. Patton understood what had happened. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Decisions were made without him. His role became ceremonial. Authority drained quietly rather than being stripped outright. This was not punishment in name, but it was removal in effect. The cost was immediate. Patton felt betrayed, not by policy, but by silence. The lack of open debate confirmed his fear that convenience had replaced clarity. He believed the West was missing an opportunity to define the post-war order on its own terms, instead allowing events to unfold reactively. Those around him saw it differently. To them, restraint was not weakness. It was necessity. Europe was exhausted. The public wanted peace, not confrontation. Leaders believed that time could moderate tensions, that cooperation might evolve into stability. Patton did not share that optimism. The aftermath was orderly on the surface. Command structures held. Occupation proceeded. Agreements were signed. The alliance remained intact. There were no resignations, no public disputes, no dramatic confrontations. But trust shifted. Those who had sidelined Patton never fully forgot his warnings. They simply chose not to act on them. His supporters grew quieter. His critics felt vindicated by the absence of immediate crisis. The moment passed, but it did not disappear. Long-term consequences began to surface slowly. Soviet consolidation in Eastern Europe accelerated. Political boundaries hardened, cooperation narrowed. What had been framed as temporary arrangements became permanent realities. Patton did not live to see how fully his concerns would echo in the years ahead. But his removal from influence marked a turning point. The West had chosen stability over confrontation, consensus over dissent. History would later debate whether that choice delayed an inevitable conflict or prevented an unnecessary one. At the time, the decision felt final. The alliance moved forward, intact but altered. A voice that warned too early had been contained. A future that might have been confronted directly was deferred. The war was over, but something else had already begun. The final stage unfolded quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement. Patton's removal from influence did not make headlines. There was no dramatic dismissal, no official condemnation that future historians could point to as the moment everything changed. Instead, his authority simply stopped expanding. Then it began to shrink. He remained visible, but no longer decisive. Present, but no longer central. This was how power was withdrawn in an alliance that feared open fracture. For Washington, the calculation was complete. The immediate post-war environment demanded stability above all else. Europe was shattered. Governments were fragile. Public patience was exhausted. Any suggestion that yesterday's ally might become tomorrow's enemy was considered irresponsible, even dangerous. Patton's mistake was not his analysis, it was his timing. Strategists who privately shared his concerns chose silence. Diplomats who recognized the warning signs chose delay. Political leaders chose flexibility, believing that ambiguity preserved options. Each decision was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns have consequences. As months passed, the geopolitical landscape hardened. Temporary administrative zones became fixed borders. Coalition language softened while control mechanisms intensified. What had been justified as stabilization increasingly resembled consolidation. Patton's earlier warnings began to sound less radical and more predictive. But by then, the moment to act had passed. Those who had sidelined him rarely admitted error. Instead, they reframed the outcome. Tensions, they argued, were unavoidable. The Cold War was not caused by ignored warnings, but by incompatible systems. Patton, in this interpretation, had merely been impatient. That explanation was comforting. It removed responsibility. The truth was more complicated. Patton had not offered a solution so much as a confrontation with reality. He had forced leaders to consider whether unity was being preserved at the cost of strategic clarity. When that question became too uncomfortable, the questioner was removed from the room. This was not unique to Patton. It was a recurring feature of coalition warfare. Alliances survive by suppressing certain truths until survival is no longer at risk, but what is delayed does not disappear. It accumulates, it reshapes the future quietly. By the time Western policy openly acknowledged Soviet expansionism, the strategic environment had changed, positions were entrenched. Leverage was reduced, options were narrower. The cost of response was higher. Patton had warned early. That was both his strength and his liability. History would later grant him partial vindication, but not in the way he might have wanted. He was remembered as perceptive but difficult, correct but uncontrollable. A commander whose instincts were sharp, but whose presence complicated consensus. In coalition systems, consensus is often valued above correctness. The long-term lesson was not about Patton himself. It was about how institutions manage inconvenient insight. When warnings threaten cohesion, they are often reframed as personality flaws. When predictions arrive too early, they are labeled provocation. When clarity risks instability, ambiguity is rewarded. This is how alliances fail quietly. Not with betrayal, not with collapse, but with postponed reckoning. Patton did not see the Cold War unfold. He did not witness NATO form or the Iron Curtain descend across Europe. But the logic he described became the organizing principle of the post-war world. His exclusion was not an accident of temperament. It was a deliberate choice made by leaders who believed time was on their side. Time rarely is. The alliance survived the war. It even survived the immediate peace, but it emerged changed, more cautious, more political, less willing to confront uncomfortable realities head-on. Trust became conditional. Strategy became reactive. The war was won. The peace was managed. The future was deferred, and in that deferral lay the real cost of ignoring a warning that arrived too soon. If you want to understand how power really works, how alliances preserve themselves, how voices are silenced without being disproven, and how history turns on decisions made to avoid discomfort, then this story matters. If this kind of calm, analytical World War II history helps you see the past more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories like this are coming.